Oh, see, then it wasn't. Unless it was. That was his Miles, who was.
Oh, okay.
Miles.
Hi, I think I Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Good. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're so pleased to have you for the conversation to celebrate the publication of Surrealists in New York, Atelier 17 and the Birth of Abstract Expressionism by Charles Darwent, published by Thames and Hudson. Charles will be in conversation with Nancy Princenthal, and I'll just introduce them briefly. Charles Darwent is an art critic and reviewer who contributes regularly to The Guardian, the art newspaper, Apollo, and the Times Literary Supplement. From 1999 to 2013, Darwent was the Independent on Sunday's chief art critic. His previous books are Mondrian in London, How English Art Nearly Became Modern, and Joseph Alba's Life and Work. Darwent appeared in the Netflix series Raiders of the Lost Art from 2014 to 2016. Nancy Princenthal is a writer whose books include Agnes Martin, Her Life and Art, Unspeakable Acts, Women, Art and Sexual Violence in the 1970s, and Hannah Wilkie. Her essays have appeared in monographs on Doris Salcedo, Robert Mangold, Willie Cole, and Gary Simmons. She is a contributing editor of Art in America and has written for Bomb, the New York Times, Apollo, and Hyperallergic, and she has taught at Bard College, Princeton University, Yale University, and the School of Visual Arts. Surrealists in New York, Atelier 17, and the Birth of Abstract Expressionism makes a strong case for Atelier 17, the print studio run by Stanley William Hayter from 1927 to 1947 as a singular force in modern art. By telling its story, we're taking it on a journey from Paris to New York and back again during a significant period of change for the art milieus of both cities. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Charles and Nancy for a conversation on the book.
Thank you, Daisy, and thank you, brave souls who have come out in the middle of this, whatever it is, newest apocalyptic experience we're going through. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the chance to talk to Charles Darwent about a really fantastic book, informative and a pretty ripping yarn. It's it's an interesting story and one of these tales that tells us things about an era and a set of people that we think we know something about. The Atelier was a nexus and a very sociable place. Studio 17 was in New York for 10 years, from 1940
well, 15 years, really.
15 years.
Sorry, does this work?
Originated in Paris. And one of the first things that we did talk to each other for a few minutes before coming into the bookstore. And one of the first things that we want to dispel, I'll ask you this question, is that there was some, horribly fractious relationship between the Americans and the Europeans. And that this is a story about how America stole the idea of modern art.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. The title of a well-known book, of course, how America stole the idea of modern art. So, does this work? Can you hear me? I suppose it's no. Okay. Hello? Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. So that I've noticed in a couple of critiques of the book that's the story that they're telling, that this is about a group of talented French people coming here and wily Americans stealing their ideas. The book could not be less about that, in fact. Paris, obviously, during the 1930s was an extraordinary place. Relatively few of the artists who were there were actually French. When you think of the great names of the Parisian avant-garde, you get Mondrian, who's Dutch, Picasso, who's Spanish, etc., etc., etc. And so too with the people who came here to escape Nazism. So, Yves Tanguy and André Masson were both French, but almost none of the other artists were. So, I mean, that makes it a rather more kind of nuanced story than perhaps. I also think on the receiving end that, you know, Willem de Kooning was born in Holland, that William Basiotis was Greek, that, you know, that it's a much more complex story than that story. Years ago, a historian called Martika Sorwin wrote a book that many of you will have read, I'm sure, called The Surrealists in Exile, which was courageous in announcing that the Surrealists had been in America at all. It had been really quite largely forgotten. What she didn't really hit on was how there was an obvious influence. I mean, the young American artists were very, very excited to find that all these French people they'd only read about in magazines were here. But none of them, with the exception of Robert Motherwell, spoke French. On their part, am I leaping ahead of you,
No,
Nancy?
go
Good.
ahead.
On the French side, of course, the French had this kind of absolute abhorrence of English. And André Breton famously said when he came here that he said, you know, I'm not going to learn a word of this barbaric language. He said, de peur de polluer mon français, in case I pollute my French. And he didn't. And André Masson, likewise. I went to see his son, who's a conductor and composer, and said, you know, did your father learn to speak any English while he was here? And he said, Monsieur Darwent, pas un mot, which turned out not to be true, in fact. I did see that he used the word chocolates in a thank you letter to Kurt Valentin, but that was the only word of English I found that he'd used. So the question really is how, there very obviously is a change in art in New York after the arrival of these exiles. How did that exchange take place when neither of them could speak the other's language? Which is a question that I think Martika Sorwin didn't really have time to address. I mean, it's an amazing book, but you know, and so really, in a way, that's what that's what this book is about. Is where did that cultural exchange happen? And I think the answer is at Atelier 17.
So actually, that was going to be my next question,
Ah.
is whether you could sort of walk us through exactly what the mechanism of those interactions was, given partly that, you know, the language barrier was never really breached, or not that effectively, and also, you know, what the balance was there between actually teaching, because it was a teaching
Sure.
facility, teaching students or studio users how to make prints, and something else. There's a quote I want to read from the book. Printmaking was not the only or even the most important thing that went on in the studio. So what actually went on?
Yes. I often think of Faye Weldon, the novelist, who, if she was ever asked anything about any of her books, would say, I haven't read it yet. It's so what did go on? Let me just get my book out, sorry. It was two studios. So by day, first of all, when Bill Hayter opened the studio in 1940, it was at the New School on the 7th floor. And he taught New School students. They were by and large, you know, hopeless, had never done any printing before, that kind of stuff. And most of them, you know, remain completely unheard of, as would be true of students at most art schools in the world, I suppose. You know, 1 in 1,000 we might hear of, but 999 we won't. But what he did was he left the studio open. He got permission to have the keys, and he would give them out to trusted friends. And after 1940, those trusted friends, who he called his anciens, his ancients, were increasingly French. So people like Masson would turn up, and they hated being in New York. You know, they felt so homesick. They thought the coffee was awful, and they did nothing but moan in that French sort of way. So they started using Atelier 17, first of all, I think, as a kind of club, an evening club. And they would all experiment there. And you see the excitement that the French felt at being here. The excitement wasn't all one way by any means. I do recommend reading in this book some of the reactions of the French to being here and what they thought America was. You know, they thought of it as this kind of place of great savagery. You know, they were living in Connecticut. And they do things like walk through Central Park. Denis de Rougemont walks through, there's a night with a thunderstorm, and he overhears all the animals in the zoo kind of there are elephants trumpeting and flamingos flapping and all this kind of stuff. And he says, it is savage, it is dark, it is America. And you think, well, actually elephants aren't American, but, you know, so, yeah, so that gang then started going and making work. And you can see in the work that they make when they first get to America that they're so excited to be here. And the stuff they make is so liberated, really, compared with what they were making under the thumb of André Breton, by and large, in Paris. And then you get young people like Jackson Pollock and Roscoe and people going along and making work by their side, unable to speak to them, but you know, but able to watch what they're doing, and that really, I think, is the vector for change. And especially, I think the biggest thing is between André Masson, who makes this amazing automatic engraving when he gets there. I suppose that's the only way of describing it, called Rape or Wrapped. I suppose the mistranslation is because he didn't know how to speak English, so he probably just pointed at two different words in a dictionary and said, yes, both of those. And you see the reaction of Jackson Pollock to that work, you know, that it contains all kinds of freedoms that he's never been able to have. I think it's true to say that American art in the 30s, because of the Depression, because Roosevelt, hooray, had set up the Federal Arts Project, which Bill Hayter admired enormously, but, you know, it was producing kind of the world famous artist George Bolster, right? Yeah, the kind of art that was made in the 30s under the Federal Arts Project was pretty sort of mundane, really. It had to be. I mean, it was, you know, taxpayers' dollars paying for it. They had to produce a kind of art that taxpayers wouldn't be frightened by. And then suddenly, you know, you went to Atelier 17 and you saw people, you know, Hayter would start by saying, destroy the plate, which people would be absolutely horrified by, I imagine. Yeah.
So there was a kind of sociability that is part and parcel of any printmaking workshop. There's, you know, there's education going on in the sense that people are picking up techniques, learning from each other, and from the example that Hayter and Masson set. There is the opportunity for artists to gather in a place that feels welcoming and kind of artistically nonpartisan. And here's where I'm going to lead into the question that I know you also want to get to, of whether or not this was a welcoming place for women, and what the gender politics of to use completely anachronistic term for this period, what that was. In the introduction, you encourage readers to take a look at Christina Weil's book that is exclusively devoted to the women, and about half the workshop members, students, participants were women, a little less than half. And I'm just also going to insert another little piece in this question, because it all kind of goes together. And that's the question of, which I think is so interesting that you brought up in this book, about whether or not what the New York painters wound up doing could be called a masculinizing of art. So, or well, you know, and it goes, it's also something you attribute to Stanley Hayter, that he, you know, he had an idea of using the burin, you know, which is of course a particularly difficult tool to use. So anyway, that's a bunch of questions.
That's a bunch of questions. Let me see if I can remember them. Okay,
I'll go back.
Yeah.
To some of them.
Okay. Well, first of all, as you know, as Nancy was saying, the studio had a dual role. So by day it was teaching students, and the names of most of those students, as at any art school, have been forgotten. What's important, I think, was that almost half of them were women students, and this is very rare in America at the time, as it would have been in Britain or in Paris. During and after the war, there was a sense that women had to, you know, women who'd been allowed to do things like build bombers, that, you know, they'd had their fun now and they just had to go back to the kitchen and make apple pies. Stanley Hayter was having none of that. So, it was in terms of teaching, it was a very gender-free institution. But then there was the evening studio, and a critique, whatever it's called these days, a criticism of the book written by an American. I thought she was quite right, actually. She said it remained a boys' club. And I'm afraid that was true. I mean, art remained a boys' club, and the Atelier in that sense was no different from that. So it saddened me greatly that really I could only, because it's a rather old-fashioned history, it's a history of big names. And that's why I recommend, sorry, before I lose my thread entirely, that you read Christina Wales' book, The Women of Atelier 17, because she took a different view. It's a Yale book, I'm afraid, Harry, but she just traces the entire 15-year existence of it and all the women who went there. And it's a very good antidote really to my history in a sense. Because the only woman who made it as a big name at Atelier 17 during the period I'm writing about was Louise Bourgeois. I could have included lesser names, but it would have skewed the story rather patronizingly, I think, really. And she was such a big name, and she gets a whole chapter all to herself. I think that is important. How many of your questions did that answer? I can't remember now.
Sorry, I lumped a bunch of things together. And of
That's all
course, yes, it's important that that Louise Bourgeois' contribution be recognized, and indeed it was. And as is true, I'm sure, of everyone who participated in the in the evening, the Real Artist Club part of the program, that each was an individual, right? You're telling a story not just about how a social situation came to be or how a transnational situation came to be, but how a massive kind of transformation of art making came to be. So so of course to that extent Masson and Pollock become key players. So do you want to talk about that relationship a little bit? And
yeah, so of course André Masson and Jackson Pollock were both artists and therefore both liars. Masson said that he'd heard that this young painter called Pollock, who nobody had heard of at the time, that he'd seen his painting and he'd said, passé fait, and he said, I'm going to paint one myself. This turns out to be probably entirely untrue. But there definitely was, if you look at the kind of engraving that Masson is doing at the studio, and then the kind that Pollock hasn't been making at all and suddenly starts making, then it's clear neither of them, they both remembered meeting the other, but of course they couldn't have spoken to each other at all. So as Hayter said, that's not how artists learn. There's a moment in the book where Jackson Pollock gives his first ever interview when Peggy Guggenheim gives him a show in 1944, and the interviewer says, "What does this mean for American art?" And you can hear him wince, and he says, well, that's like asking a mathematician, what does it mean to American maths? There's no such thing as American art. There's just art. I don't think the French artists who came here, they were insufferably French, some of them, but they didn't think of themselves as French artists. They thought of themselves as surrealists, but mainly they thought of themselves as artists. And I think that's the kind of transference that took place was by watching. You asked me earlier about Joseph Albers and the kind of teaching that went on. There was this idea that both Joseph Albers, the great Bauhaus artist, and Stanley William Hayter shared, which was that you couldn't teach art. You could teach technique. You could liberate people's minds. You could teach all kinds of stuff, but you couldn't actually. If you set out teaching them how to make images, then in fact you were controlling them. And that was true at Black Mountain College, it was true at the Bauhaus, and it was certainly true at Atelier 17, was this idea of learning by watching. And I think that's what you see going on between Masson and, I'd like to have been a fly on the wall.
Yeah. Yes, and, of course, the exploitation of a kind of spontaneous line, which is a more kind of spontaneous cursive line, which is the commonest understanding of what was meant by psychic automatism, which is, the Breton's, key explanation of what surrealism was all about, is so overdetermined. I mean, there's so many ways that Pollock and Messon and Hayter could have come to that, line that at some point they all shared. And at the same time, the definition of what automatism was is so fluid. So what interests me about the Atelier 17 becoming a nexus for the development of that kind of automatism, cursive automatism, is that he was promoting using engraving to do that.
Yes.
So, which is like, of all the print techniques, it's the one that allows in some ways for least spontaneity. So do you want to talk about that paradox?
Yeah. So, I mean, Jackson Pollock had tried, as part of the Federal Arts program, everybody tried to do a bit of etching and engraving. And he'd been hopeless at it. He just didn't have the right temperament. And his teacher apparently left him, with a dry point needle and said, all right, by the time I come back, I want to find that you've done this. And actually it wasn't, it was a litho plate. But when he came back, he found that Jackson Pollock had found some empty paint, or some half-empty paint tubes in the desk, and he started painting the cover of the desk, and he threw him out and said, you will never make a printer. I think, so Hayter had taken as his special care this instrument called a burin. I'm sure, many of you know much more about it than I do, but it's a kind of, effectively it's a gouge. So it looks like a rather kind of lethal chisel, and I can tell you it is. That you push with a kind of wooden thing. The thing about all other engraving instruments really is that they follow the hand. So they work like a pencil or pen. So you do that. But with a burin, you push. And Hayter thought this meant that it was the perfect tool for automatic expression, because no matter how much you thought you could control it, the point of it would always get there before your brain did. So it was a way of outsmarting the hand. It seems rather kind of literal now, maybe a bit silly, but it was taken up very seriously by the people at the Atelier, and certainly by Jackson Pollock. Louise Bourgeois hated it. She felt that it was part of a kind of male conspiracy against women, because you have to be strong. With my little limp wrists, I've tried working with a burin. It's hell. It's really, really hard. Bourgeois felt that this was, it was all part of the kind of macho-ness of the studio, but I have to say Pollock really seems to have understood it. I mean, the point was not to be able to use a burin well, but simply the fact that you could never quite control it, and that's what he seems to have discovered. Yeah.
I mean, it does seem that the more natural printing technique for that kind of spontaneous drawing, unguided drawing, would be some other form of intaglio, maybe etching that involves going into a soft ground rather than pushing. And yes, Louise Bourgeois was absolutely determined to go ahead and she pushed that burin, and she did achieve a wonderful set of engravings that were made into a portfolio that, like most Atelier 17 projects, was wildly unsuccessful. This was not a money-making operation. But you also in the book you talk quite a bit about different models of automatism, and you introduce Motherwell for a second time, his really interesting notion that at this point, in New York in the 40s, it's time to dispense with the unconscious as the motivation.
Yeah.
In favor of, I couldn't quite follow.
I'm not sure he could either. But yes, I think so. There's a big debate that when the ship is setting off from France with André Breton on it, a young man comes up to him and taps him on the shoulder and says, "Hello, my name is Claude Lévi-Strauss," who we all know better as an anthropologist, but who was also a working surrealist, and who said that he'd learned his entire anthropological method was learnt from the surrealists, a taste for the uncanny and for unlikely juxtapositions of things. And he and if it had been a British ship with British artists, they would have talked about cricket probably. But because it's, because they're French, they talk about the meaning of art all the way across the Atlantic to Martinique. And it becomes like a kind of Socratic dialogue, which at the end of the voyage, Claude Lévi-Strauss writes down. As I say in the book, I think you're never quite sure who's Socrates and who's Alcibiades, because, and it is this idea of whether what Breton believed or seemed to believe was that any work produced from the unconscious was automatically a work of art. Lévi-Strauss introduces the opposite idea in that kind of Hegelian way, that no, there has to be something that he calls formulation secondaire. You've got to do something. There has to be a kind of conscious input to make it an artwork. And then he reaches this kind of conclusion that no, the very act of making art can, in certain people, unlock Jungian archetypes. And I think that's really what Motherwell is talking about. Yeah, so it's also a way of getting out from under Breton, because Breton was he was a terrible tyrant. And of course, one of the good things about coming to America was that all these kind of French surrealists who'd labored under his yoke and been excommunicated by him right and left, that they could all kind of turn around and go. And there's a wonderful moment when he's holding court or trying to hold court at lunch at the Le Jamble, as the French call it, the jumble room. And he says, I will raise my finger like this when, and Leonora Carrington bursts out laughing. And it's kind of tragic for Breton, really, but she just thinks, no, I'm sure you just don't have this control anymore. And the whole idea of what surrealism is changes and then feeds into what becomes abstract expressionism, I think. Yeah.
So yeah, so it seems like there was a lot of opportunity for being freed from constraints that
Yes.
obtained earlier. I meant to ask a few minutes ago about opportunities that women artists had for, I'm thinking Leonora Carrington, and men had places that they could gather, male artists that they could gather and talk about art into the small hours.
Sure.
And those spaces were unwelcoming to women or not available to women. And so the studio became a place for women, even if it wasn't about influencing the kinds of work that got produced. I'm curious about whether you feel the influences went from the Americans to the French in any significant way, or to the Europeans.
Well, so André Masson's son, Diego Masson, he said that after so as soon as Paris was liberated, the Massons got on the first ship they could and went back. And then Kurt Valentin, it's rather tragic. They keep getting these letters from Kurt Valentin with things like toy soldiers and chocolates and things that you couldn't get in France, just to keep them going. But at one point, he said he found an abstract expressionist work that his father had tried to paint and had just been completely frustrated that he couldn't do it, and he'd sort of smashed the frame and thrown it away, and he rescued it and restored it. And Masson said, I thought I'd taken art as far as it could go, but I look at the work of Jackson Pollock and I realize that he's taken it further than I ever could possibly have done. So there is a kind of understanding from the French that art has moved on, and there doesn't seem to be a kind of nationalist mourning about it. He's not saying, I can't do it because I'm French. He just says, I can't do it because somebody else has already done it. And it's Jackson Pollock. I think especially, but yeah. So no, as I say, it's not at all the one-way street. Yeah.
And there is, in a sense, a sort of passing of the torch that happens. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about Stanley Hayter as a character. That in a sense, this book is about forgotten histories, the forgotten history of the Atelier, but also, Masson to a certain extent, and
Yes.
Hayter for sure.
For sure, absolutely.
So,
I don't know how many of you are printers. If there are any printers here, then they will almost certainly have heard of Stanley William Hayter, because they'll have heard of Atelier 17. If you were to go to the Tamarind workshop and mention Hayter's name, people would faint. If I mentioned his name in the Museum of Modern Art, people would go, who? And I think part of the reason for that, I mean, there's that whole hierarchical thing about painting being, more esteemed than printing. But one of the big problems with Atelier 17 was it wasn't really a print workshop at all when it was here. It had been in Paris. I think it became it again when it went back to Paris. But in the 7 years covered by this book, it's a laboratory. And Hayter couldn't care less about prints. He actually says at some point, I've helped with over 5,000 plates. He doesn't say anything about the number of prints that he's helped make. And what he's really into is the whole kind of sculptural element of a metal plate being gouged and decorated. I don't think we would have got on, really. He seems to have been the kind of Englishman, a generational thing with a very drawly BBC accent, and who refers to men as chaps. Yeah, and he loved playing tennis and all kinds of dreadful things like that. So but he was also very he had that sort of false modesty that the British have that's so irritating. And so he didn't really kind of trumpet his successes. I mean, they had a hugely successful show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1944, and all Hayter said is, we got lots of footfall because they put us down by the lavatories, and it's a very kind of English thing to do, but I don't know that it does you much favors in America to be like that. Yeah.
Easily misunderstood.
Yes. And the other thing, of course, is if you want evidence of the success of a print workshop, then probably what you do is you look for prints, and there aren't any. They mostly what they did was they made trial proofs, and sometimes they didn't even do that. So famously, what happened? Jackson Pollock obviously dies in 1956. And 10 years later, there's going to be a big show at the Museum of Modern Art. And Bill Rubin goes out to, no, it's not Rubin, it's that other one whose name I can remember when I haven't just flown from New Zealand, sorry. And he goes out to Springs to ask Lee Krasner what he can borrow. And she says, well, anything you like. And he goes into the barn and finds 11 metal plates that have never been, they are the moment to me that Jackson Pollock becomes Jackson Pollock, is those plates. But nobody knows they exist because they've never been printed, they've never been editioned. And really what they were was an arena for experiment. And it's a very important experiment to Jackson Pollock. But there they were under a piece of cloth gathering dust. The Museum of Modern Art owns one print by Rothko. So far as I know, it's the only engraving Rothko ever made, and it's dated as 1951, and it says that it was made at the studio of Will Barnett. That's complete nonsense. It was in fact made at Atelier 17 in 1944. But that's, I think, why the Atelier has been forgotten, is that it didn't do itself any favors. It didn't blow its own trumpet. Rather the opposite, probably, and it left no evidence.
Yeah, well, if the plates aren't inked and editioned, yes, it's a disappearing history. But it also, probably unintentionally reinforces the connection that you also make in the book between engraving, in particular, as a printmaking process, and sculpture.
Yeah. So a number of sculptors came out of Atelier 17, the most obvious being Louise Bourgeois. And I think there's a moment when you can see her kind of wailing and moaning and pushing her burin through this metal plate and making images that you look at them and think, but actually those are sculptures. And something clicks in her head, I think, and she realizes one of the things apparently that Hayter liked students to do is to produce a long copper curl. So if you've got a copper plate and you're pushing your burin through it, she says, Dr. Freud might have something to say about this, that he judged his students by the length of the unbroken curl that they could produce. And she was always lousy at it, and she was always breaking her curls, and you just think, hello. But something seems to have clicked in her mind, and she thought, I am actually making sculpture. I'm sculpting in metal, and these things don't have to be two-dimensional. And the next show she has in 1947 is where she shows those first figures that have come really from her print series, He Disappeared into Complete Silence. Yeah, I think most of the people whose names we know, most of the people who appear in the book, never went on to have a printing career at all. Motherwell, Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, and Louise Bourgeois. I mean, Louise Bourgeois went on making prints, but of a kind that were not, defiantly not Hayteresque, I think. Yeah.
She returned to printmaking in force toward the end of her career. But yes, there's the carving into the plate is so close to sculpture.
Can I just say about the prints she made right at the end of her life when Hayter was safely dead, because boy could she bear a grudge, that lady.
Yes, for sure.
And she made a series of prints, one of which was called Le Cauchemar de Stanley William Hayter, Hayter's Nightmare, and My Answer to Stanley William Hayter. And they're like the least Hayteresque prints you can imagine, because they're made photographically and they wouldn't have required any strength at all. And also there are pictures of kind of crocheted cloth, which had become a big thing in her life. And you think, good for you,
Yep. Maybe last question before we take questions from the audience. You have written a book about Joseph Albers, and you've already alluded to him. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the two men as educators and influencers, and gauge where we are with respect to the importance of, the kind of surrealism that was fostered at Atelier 17.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned the ideas of pedagogy, so that that art couldn't be taught. There was also kind of a degree of social experiment. So when the Alberses moved to Mexico, what they really loved about indigenous art was the fact that it was unsigned, that it was anonymous, and that it kept on producing the same forms again and again and again and again. So that was very kind of Bauhaus view of the world. There was also kind of slightly what was going on at, this idea of originality wasn't important at, the experimental originality was important, but the idea of authorship was less important at Atelier 17, which did its historical relevance no favors at all. Of course, one of the reasons it's forgotten is there are too few signatures. I think what was interesting is that when the French arrive in 1941, that everybody wants to be a surrealist, and that by the time the war is over, nobody will own up to being a surrealist, because it's not cool anymore. It seems too European. Already this narrative that Europeans are untrustworthy and almost certainly effeminate has it's begun to bite. And you get people like Clement Greenberg, who should have known better because he was there saying, oh, they were all surrealists, they had no influence at all. And really it's only Robert Motherwell who stands up much later and says, I've been part of two cultural milieus in my life, one in Paris, and then when the Surrealists came to New York, and I've never understood why it was called abstract expressionism. It should have been called abstract surrealism. But in the kind of rewriting of American art history, I think that followed in the Cold War, then that had to be done away with. That just, that wasn't allowed. Yeah.
Along with the masculinizing of art, there was the,
yes.
the Americanizing of art as a kind of abortive form of cultural diplomacy. But
which Greenberg was also guilty of, I think, wasn't he? He was a terrible misogynist. I mean, he didn't like what he called decorative art, and printmaking definitely came under that. It was kind of women's work, and so no picture that was less than a meter square was worth considering, he said. So it's a shame, because I've always rather loved him, but I loved him less after I'd written this book. So.
Maybe it is time to turn this over to questions. Yeah.
I think if I keep my mask on, here, that would be better.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Or we can do it in International Sign Language.
I tend to, because I'm not sure I can give my physical information. It's a fallacy, isn't it, to say that because something is not a product of the conscious mind, that it must therefore spring from the unconscious mind. Right?
Yes, I would imagine. Yeah.
The question is, in the light of that, how did these people identify the property of an object such that it did spring from the unconscious mind. Let's say, so it's
Yeah.
not enough just to say, well, it didn't spring from the conscious mind. It has to be something else. And I'm curious whether it's a very hard thing to talk about when you don't have a common language to talk about. I'm having trouble talking about it.
Right. I think. Well, I mean, I think it's a great logical flaw in the whole thing is that assumption that if you sit down like Breton and Philippe Soupeau did in 1919 and just go righty, that eventually, if you stop spelling things properly, you don't use grammar and syntax, that means it's coming from the unconscious mind. I mean, that does seem nonsensical to me. Yeah. I think the first generation of Surrealism was really what they called oneric painting. So you get people like Dali painting melting clocks hanging from trees. But how spontaneous is that? You know, it's all the stuff he learned at art school in Madrid, the Bellas Artes, and you know that picture it involves perspective and all kinds of color theories that he's learned. And yeah, and yes.
Was there an interest?
I would imagine that. I mean, they by nature couldn't have spoken about it. They couldn't have discussed it. Yeah. I mean, the French certainly discussed it among themselves. So, you know, Lévi-Strauss, who comes out as a kind of surprise hero of this book in many ways, I think. But no, I think it was probably just the people like Pollock looking at the images that were being made and thinking, wow. Because oddly enough, it wasn't all that he was learning at the time, but the Federal Arts Project paintings were harked back to a kind of safe America that was very much, it was kind of somebody called the old wooden bucket and the rocking chair on the stoop kind of imagery. The one thing it didn't really look at was First Nations painting. So it never produced any kind of native, you know, there were no images of Native American art, for example. It just didn't feed into that narrative of a safe America. And there's a show of Navajo sand painting in 1941 when people, Jackson Pollock and Max Ernst, are both kind of absolutely fascinated by it. You know, so there's a hunger for a new way of working that I think, you know, they would see on the plate at Atelier 17. I don't imagine Jackson Pollock and Claude Lévi-Strauss sitting down, even if they could have done, and having a long conversation about the yeah. Good question, though, Hein. Pull that face again. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that, alongside this kind of great fascination with and envy of European artists that people like Pollock felt was, of course, a deep loathing because Julian Levy promoted, or you know, it wasn't going to sell American art very much. I mean, so if you were called André Masson, you probably had more chance of having a show in Manhattan than if you were called Jackson Pollock, for example. And so Peggy Guggenheim comes in, and she really takes up. You know, she gives Pollock his first show, and things like that. And she absolutely changes the balance of kind of art that is sellable and regarded as avant-garde and American. Really, I have to say, in the kind of strangest way, I went to lunch about 10 years ago at Her Majesty's Prison, Pentonville, because I used to do prison work there, and I sat opposite this charming older American man who died last week, unfortunately. I patiently explained, he asked what I did, and I patiently explained to him what the Bauhaus was. And he said, in that accent that you don't hear anymore, he said, oh yes, my father was at the Bauhaus. And it turned out he was Jonathan Bayer, who was Herbert Bayer's son. But in fact, he was Julian Levy's son. He was Herbert Bayer's stepson. I don't know why I'm throwing that pointless little remark into this conversation, but certainly Julian Levy, if you look at the kind of the gallery records and things. There's no interest in American art at all on his part in the 1930s and earlier. And it's only, I think Peggy Gunn was a real kind of heroine in that regard, you know, that she Americanizes the avant-garde, yeah. If that, was that what you were asking? Because yeah, oh, good, okay. Oh, yeah.
A year ago, there were a few of Hayter's prints on display everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about whether any, how many of the ones from that first show were acquired by Berger and to what extent they have continued to include those first exhibitions.
Now, that is the kind of question that one always fears, because I really don't know the answer, actually. One of the sad things I think about Hayter is that until his dying day, he thought of himself not as a printer, but as a painter. His last widow is still alive. She was 41 years younger than him, and she has got, you know, a warehouse full of unsellable Stanley William Hayter paintings, because he became what is the word, bookmarked or whatever it's called, as a printer. And I think in America, as in Britain, you're not allowed to be two things. So he was, but I don't know how many Hayter paintings are, for example, at the Museum of Modern Art, and how often they're shown. I would imagine a few and never would be the answer. I've just been in New Zealand. I was talking to a woman who was at the Victoria Art Gallery in Melbourne, and she said it was really useful reading the book, because she said we had a Hayter and we just never showed it because we didn't know how to historicize it. Also, they're really hideous, a lot of them. You know, they kind of set out to be, he painted in these kind of, he invented psychedelia before the psychedelics did. It was, he painted in these kind of like vomit green colors and things. And it's, and she suddenly said, you know, we've really got to get that picture out of storage, and you know, now we can see a context for it. But he wasn't interesting. What was his name, Jewel? You know, the art critic of the New York Times, who writes nice things about everybody. When he gets to Hayter, he says Hayter is a very difficult painter, and you think, well, yeah, really, he was. Yeah. I know that's not the answer to the question you asked, but yeah, no. You're lucky you missed most of it. Okay.